Our next speaker will be Dr. Kris Lehnhardt, who's a professor at George Washington University School of Medicine, and he is one of the lead flight surgeons of the Mars Desert Research Station program.
All right. How are we doing? Can everyone hear me okay? Very good. Thank you. So, first of all, as mentioned, my name is Kris Lehnhardt. I'm an attending physician and an assistant professor at George Washington University. And good morning, obviously, to all of you. Hope you've had a good morning so far. Thank you to the Mars Society for inviting me to be here. I am no longer, but I used to be one of the flight surgeons for the Mars Desert Research Station. So if they had a medical issue while on mission, they would contact myself or one of my colleagues, and we would try to provide them with good medical advice about what they were supposed to do with their medical problem. But today I've been asked to come here and talk to you a little bit more about human health in space. And you'll notice that I've titled this an introduction to human health in space, and the reason for that I'll explain in a moment. But just to give you a little bit more background about myself, so my board specialty, my certification is in emergency medicine. I'm board certified in Canada and the United States. But I've done training in aerospace medicine with flight surgeons from NASA, from the Canadian Space Agency. If you haven't heard it already, I'm sure something Canadian will come out of my mouth soon. And I've also trained with the Canadian Armed Forces. At GW, one of the things that I do is I am the director of a fellowship in extreme environmental medicine, which is a fairly unique program, and it's designed to test and train physicians to treat people in extreme environments. So obviously, when you think about an extreme environment, there could be no more extreme environment than space. One of the other things I do at GW is I teach an Introduction to Human Health in Space graduate course. And recently, I had the fortune of being the chair at the International Space University Space Studies program of the Human Performance in Space Department. As mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a bit today about human health in space. And this is a topic that I am always happy to talk about. And the reason for that is that a personal mission for me is helping people to really understand what it's like to have humans in space, for them to live and work in space and stay healthy. And in the space community, or the broader space community, I often get asked what I do. And when I say that I'm a doctor, if I'm at a space conference, people will say, "Oh, why are you here?" And I'll say, well, there are people in space, and those people need doctors. So I see it as my personal mission to kind of spread the word, if you will, about human health in space. And today what I'm going to do is provide you with an introduction to some of the issues of human health in space. This obviously will not be an exhaustive list of all of the issues, of which there are many, but I'm going to go through some of them in a very introductory fashion, because even though we understand, for instance, that bone and muscle changes in space, many people don't really understand how that works or why. So we're going to run through some of these issues. But a way to approach human health in space that I like to use is breaking it down into two categories. We are extremely adaptable as a species. The reason that we've been able to basically conquer every place on this planet is because we adapt really well to an environment. So one of the things that we do in space is we go through normal adaptation. Your body, when you go to space, doesn't know that you're ever going home again. So it starts to change itself in a way that works and makes sense for that environment. So our bone and muscle loss, our changes in blood volume, that is a normal adaptation to spaceflight. We may not like it because someday we want to go back to gravity, and therefore it poses all kinds of problems for us. But if you go to space, your body is trying to live properly and efficiently in space. So we go through normal adaptation, but then we also have to respond to a lot of noxious factors. Things like radiation, like isolation, like acceleration. Our bodies can try to adapt to that, but we really can't. Where we excel in these areas is by using our knowledge and our skills and our technology to keep ourselves alive in a place where, quite frankly, we're generally not supposed to be. We have to use our brains to make it possible. So if we talk first about normal adaptation, we always have to start with fluid shifts. So people understand in general that when I'm standing here right now, gravity is pulling my blood down into my legs. When you go into space and that gravity is gone, that fluid redistributes. And as it does, it comes up into my upper body, into my head, and it changes the proportion of where the fluid is in your body. And the way this is often referred to is puffy-faced bird leg syndrome. So astronauts get swollen faces and heads, and their legs shrink. And this astronaut here, this is, when you look up puffy-faced bird legs on the internet, this is the face that comes up every time. So his name is Dan Brandenstein. I looked him up yesterday. So he's not just a faceless person, he's a real person, but he is the face of puffy-faced bird legs. So when this fluid shifts, our bodies adapt. So what happens is my heart distends. It gets bigger. The volume inside my heart gets bigger. And when that happens, my heart sends signals to my body saying, you've got too much blood volume. You have to get rid of it. So how do we do that? Well, we pee it out. So one of the first things that happens to people when they go to space is they start peeing more, because your body is getting rid of fluid that you no longer need. When that happens, your heart actually gets a little bit smaller. So the heart volume decreases, the blood volume decreases, and you're not as thirsty. So you won't drink as much water in space because you don't need as much blood volume in that environment. When I'm standing here on Earth, the reason that I'm able to keep talking to you and I don't pass out is because my body is sending blood to my brain. If every one of us were to lay down on the ground for 10 minutes and then suddenly jump up and stand up, some of us might pass out when that happens. And that's because your body has to change to adapt to that new position. As you stand up and the gravity pulls all that blood out of your brain, your body sends signals from pressure receptors called baroreceptors, which are in your carotid arteries and your aorta, the big blood vessel in your chest. And those send signals to your body that says, you've got to get more blood to the brain and fast. So you feel lightheaded because all the blood is coming out of your brain. Your body responds and pushes more blood up. And it does that by having your heart pump more blood with every beat, and by tightening up all the blood vessels and squishing and pushing all the blood up to your brain. Well, in space, this serves no purpose. I don't need it. So if there's no gravity pulling any of my blood anywhere, it goes wherever it wants to with no force against it, or very little force against it. So as a result, when you're in space, you lose this response, which is one of the reasons why when people come back to Earth after they've been in space for a long time and they stand up, they pass out. So again, your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's being efficient and getting rid of things you don't need while you're in spaceflight, in microgravity. If your heart doesn't have to push against gravity, and your body is all about being efficient, your heart will get smaller in space, and that is indeed what happens. We lose about 10% of our cardiac muscle mass when we go to space because it's pushing against less force. It doesn't have to fight gravity all the time. So this is your body finding a new homeostasis, a new steady state balance where it reduces energy expenditure. Everything's about conserving energy in our bodies. When I pee out this extra blood volume, but I've still got all my blood cells, my blood becomes more concentrated. And when it becomes more concentrated, your body thinks you've got too many blood cells. So one of the things that it does is it decreases your production of erythropoietin. That's a hormone made by your kidneys, which tells your bone marrow to make more blood cells. So all astronauts become anemic. They have less hemoglobin because they have less red blood cells. That's a normal adaptation to the spaceflight environment. So that occurs because your body's trying to be efficient again. The one that we care about a lot, and you hear about a lot, is bone and muscle loss. And again, I seem to be going over the same point over and over again, but your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's trying to conserve energy and get rid of things it does not need. In space, I do not need the bone mass that I have. I do not need the muscle mass that I have. So as a result, when you spend time in space, you lose about 1% of your bone per month, which increases your risk of fractures. Not in space, but when you go back to a gravity environment, that's where you're at most risk for fractures. However, in space, as your bone breaks down, we release all this calcium into our blood. And that calcium gets filtered by our kidneys, and we basically pee it out. But if we don't get rid of all of it quick enough, it forms kidney stones. So that's one of the reasons why kidney stones are more common in astronauts. Full recovery of your bone loss from a 6-month mission can take up to 900 days to get your bone back to where it was when you first left the Earth. Your muscles, you mostly lose muscle in your legs, because as I'm doing right now, my legs are used for posture and for keeping me upright against gravity. In space, where there's no gravity and there's no up and there's no down, my legs don't have that much work to do. Most of the work you do in space is with your arms, pulling and pushing yourself around. So your leg muscles also get significantly smaller, but we're much better at redeveloping our leg muscles, or our muscles in general. So recovery from a 6-month mission, full recovery for muscle loss, is about 30 days. If we were to go to space and we were to stay in a microgravity environment and we never wanted to land on a celestial body again that had some form of gravity, we could just let this bone loss and muscle loss occur. We may not need any more. But because we eventually want to go back to some place that has gravity, whether it's Mars at 3/8 or Earth at 1 gravity, we need countermeasures. And so that's where dietary things come into play, where medications come into play, and exercise is a big part of this. Right now on space station, they spend about 2.5 hours a day, 6 days a week exercising, just to maintain and prevent bone and muscle loss so that when they come back to Earth, they can recover more quickly. One of the other things that people talk about a lot in spaceflight right now are visual changes. You may have heard of this referred to as VIIP, or visual impairment and intracranial pressure. One of the interesting things about this is that we don't know if this is a normal adaptation of the spaceflight environment or if this is some response to a noxious stimulus. It could be microgravity. Some people think it's related to salt intake. Other people believe it's related to higher carbon dioxide levels within the space station. And last but not least, it may also be related to the specific exercise that we're doing. So the resistive exercise, the resistance exercise where you're lifting weights in space may have a role to play in this. But we have found that people have raised intracranial pressure and that they have visual impairment, and those two things, we don't know if they're directly related to one another or not quite yet. That's still being studied. But interestingly, it only affects about 50% of astronauts. And to date, it has only affected male astronauts. There have been no female astronauts who have reported this problem. The varying severity of symptoms is really interesting because some people see a little spot in their vision or need different glasses. Other people have actual field loss, so visual loss in a specific area of their vision, which may or may not ever come back. So it's a very interesting problem. We don't really know what's causing it yet. It might be a normal adaptation, or it's a response to a noxious factor, which is what we will talk about right now. So the space environment is a low-pressure vacuum environment, and there's no oxygen. So we have to create our own habitats. So to do that, on the space station, we create a 1-atmosphere environment. So the space station is a shirt-sleeve environment, meaning that every one of us, the way that we're dressed right now, could live in the space station, no problem. So it is 1 atmosphere, which is our pressure right here, and 21% oxygen. But every time you leave the station and you go out into a space suit, you're going into a different environment, a lower pressure environment with more oxygen in it. And every time you move from a high pressure environment to a low pressure environment, you are then at risk for decompression illness. So anyone who's gone scuba diving has heard of the bends, and you can get the bends in space every time you go through a decompressive stress. So every spacewalk is a decompressive stress. This is something we cannot adapt to. Our bodies are not able to deal with this, so we have to deal with this using skills and knowledge and technology. So we know that as pressure decreases, the amount of gas dissolved in a liquid decreases. Every time you open a soda bottle and you pop the top off and the bubbles start coming up, that's basically decompression illness. In your body, we've all got dissolved nitrogen. And if I go from high pressure to low pressure, and that nitrogen decides to start forming bubbles inside my body, those bubbles cause problems. They form in tissues or in the bloodstream. When they form in tissues, they distort those tissues. So a bubble that forms in your spinal cord and starts distorting your spinal cord is going to cause neurological problems. If those bubbles are in the bloodstream and they block blood flow, if it's blocking blood flow to my brain, that's going to cause a stroke. So there are issues related to decompression illness that occur or can occur in space that we have to deal with from a technology standpoint. We can't adapt to this type of environment. Another interesting pressure-related problem is called ebullism. And this is a problem which only occurs when you go above a certain altitude. It's called Armstrong's line. It's around 63,000 feet. And that's the point where the partial pressure of the water in your body exceeds the pressure of your environment. So here's an astronaut in a pressure suit, in a vacuum chamber, holding a beaker of water. And that water is boiling at room temperature. So if you're in a spacesuit or you're in a space habitat and that place loses pressure, theoretically this is what happens to your blood. And the water in your body then starts to boil. And you can imagine that is not good for the human body. We cannot adapt to this. We have to deal with this using technology. We really don't adapt well to noise. We don't like loud environments. Space is an extremely loud environment. There's that whole thing about in space no one can hear you scream. Well, that's outside. But inside, in the space station, it's really loud. You can go online and you can listen to audio tracks of what it sounds like on station real time. It is very loud. So fans, avionics, pumps, exercise equipment, everything makes noise in space, and it's all cumulative. And as a result, people get exposed to high levels of noise in space for prolonged periods of time, and it causes serious problems. It affects them psychologically and it affects them physiologically. So they have poor communications with each other and with the ground. They get hearing loss and vertigo. They get nauseous. They get really sleepy. They get irritated. It has a negative effect on everyone in the crew. So controlling noise in a spaceflight environment is essential. We do not adapt very well to high noise environments. We get really irritated. Toxic exposures are one thing that we also cannot adapt to. If you're living in a closed environment and your water, your food, or your air becomes contaminated, you're in serious trouble. Infectious diseases like bacteria and fungi obviously will cause problems if we get various types of infections. Sanitation issues. If the toilet is broken on the space station, according to a few astronauts I've spoken to, nothing else matters until it's fixed. It is essential that they have a functioning toilet up there. Any fire in station is a big deal. Carbon monoxide and gases can build up quickly and are life-threatening. And the fuels we use for space flight, moving around in space, hypergolic fuels, are extremely toxic to humans, and any exposure to those are potentially lethal as well. So again, things that we don't adapt to very well. Last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about space radiation. We do not adapt to radiation exposure. Space radiation comes from galactic cosmic radiation and solar particle events, and it affects us based upon the type of radiation. We know a lot about Earth-based radiation. We don't know very much about space-based radiation in terms of how it's going to affect humans. It depends upon the energy and mass of the particles, and space radiation tends to be heavier in mass and also higher energy. The dose, the amount you're exposed to, and the duration of exposure are very important. And radiation generally causes cell damage, which our bodies are pretty good at fixing. But every once in a while, if there's too much damage, they'll either become overwhelmed our systems, or they'll start making mistakes. And when a cell functions in a way that's different than it's supposed to, that's a mutagenic change. When a cell starts rapidly dividing in an uncontrolled fashion, that's a carcinogenic change. And what we know from studying long-term radiation exposure on the ground is that it has negative effects on us. Cancer is obviously the biggest one. Lots of different types of cancers are related to radiation, but it affects many other systems in our body as well. So reproductive system, wound healing, your heart, your brain, your eyes. Our body generally does not like radiation, does not adapt to radiation. We have to use technology to deal with radiation. So in order to protect and mitigate against radiation exposure, we determine acceptable limits. And we try to keep things as low as reasonably achievable, and that level can change depending upon the risk that you're willing to accept. But in order to understand the risk, we have to understand the way that space radiation affects our biology. And we really do not understand that very well. When we're trying to deal with radiation, we want to use shielding, if we can, which works for solar particle events. Current shielding doesn't work that well for galactic cosmic radiation. We want to use medications and nutritional changes to try and protect against or deal with radiation effects. And then ideally, we want to select people who are somewhat radioprotected. So some people are more susceptible to radiation than others. This is just an overview or an idea of some of the types of issues that we face in space. There's a lot more that I haven't talked about. Psychology being a big one, human reproduction, nutrition, medical care. But if we're going to deal with all these human health issues, we're going to deal with them hopefully through all of the research and work that's being done. And the Human Research Program at NASA does have a number of different elements that look at this. There's the Advanced Exploration Systems group at NASA that also works on this. But there's also the international partners, academia, different companies and industry that also are working on all of these types of problems. So in summary, I believe and I hope that the success of our future human deep space exploration occurs. I hope we are successful, but it's going to depend upon us taking risks. But if we're going to take risks, let's take smart risks. Let's understand the effects of spaceflight on the human body and develop effective solutions and countermeasures for it. And a lot of work has been done to date. We've made great progress, and there's still a lot of work to do, and it is ongoing. And I hope that we will get there very soon. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks for a great talk.
Welcome.
I have a question about allergies. I was wondering if, in your experience, has anyone in the space station or during space flight, I guess, incurred an allergy? I know they can happen throughout your lifetime, at random times. Has this ever happened in your experience?
Allergy is a great question, or allergy exposure in space is a great question. To the best of my knowledge, any allergic reactions that have occurred in space have probably been minor. When I've seen lists of the major types of reactions or medical problems in space, the most severe form of allergy, called anaphylaxis, I have not seen that on a list. It may be because of the way that selection is done. There may also be testing that's done prior to a mission to ensure that no one is anaphylactic. If someone were to have a minor allergic reaction, there's a lot of different medications on station right now that can be taken. You're supposed to consult with the flight surgeon before you take medication. There are a list of ones where you don't have to, and those medications typically do get used up, but astronauts don't tend to keep a record of when or why they use those medicines. So if someone were to have taken an antihistamine medication on station for an allergic reaction, that is one of the type of medications that I don't believe is reportable necessarily, so they may not have said why they took it. So it certainly could occur, but I've never heard of a serious allergic reaction in space.
Yes, hello, I'm Bruce McKenzie. I had not heard that some people were more susceptible to radiation. Is there any way to test for this? You know, could you give a blood test? Does it run in families? And looking further forward, when we're doing for settlement, might there be families that are better suited for
So thank you very much for your question. I appreciate it. It's a touchy subject because now you're talking about selecting people based upon their genetic makeup for a mission. And it is a very tricky area to deal with. There certainly are people who are at higher risk for certain cancers, so they carry a variety of genes that we know predispose them to cancer. So in my mind, if you're going to send people who have the best chance of success on a long-term mission and you want to reduce their cancer risk, as a physician, that's one of the things that I can do to protect people, is I can test people, tell them who is most susceptible to this, and then perhaps select the crew that is the most radio protected, if you will. So it would be through testing. It would probably be through genetic testing as well as looking back at family trees of individuals and looking at what people in the past in your family have gotten in terms of cancer or other radiation-related illnesses. So there are ways to select for this, and it could be a selection criteria in the future for Mars missions or for settlement. Or you would simply use that information to instruct the astronauts as to what their risks are, tell them that they're at a higher risk for it, and if they're willing to accept that risk, then you've performed informed consent, and they've then agreed to deal with that risk, even though it's higher because they want to achieve the mission.
I think we have one more quick question.
Hi, so I had a question about the decrease in heart mass that you see. And so my main question is, so when you see this decrease in heart mass, is it just an overall, the heart gets smaller, or are there more specific changes to the geometry, like a decrease in the wall thickness that can change the function, and whether or not this has been seen to be reversible?
So my understanding of this issue is that the volume of a heart does decrease and the cardiac muscle mass decreases. I don't believe that you're losing cells per se. I believe that those cells are generally getting smaller or shrinking as a result of the decreased need for their use. And as far as I understand it as a problem, it doesn't really have long-term effects because it is recoverable. But like all muscle, it would take time to recover. And so that process can occur and does occur, but it's not necessarily going to be an immediate response. There are other things we can do to increase our blood volume and make our hearts pump more efficiently as that cardiac muscle mass is rebuilding. So astronauts, before they come back from station, fluid load. So they drink a bunch of fluid and sometimes take salt tablets to build up their blood volume for when they come back. But your heart will recover over time. It doesn't actually, you don't lose cells, they just get slightly smaller and then redevelop or rebuild over time. Thank you very much.
so much.